the wisdom literature that goes along with that. And I've just recently started just doing Proverbs a day as kind of a thing, as a way to just read through in the morning to help me focus and think about those things. There's a ton of value in Proverbs. There's a lot of wisdom found within there. And I think that there's going to be a transition into more of the wisdom literature, I believe, when Ben gets back. I can't remember if he said it was Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, yeah. I love Ecclesiastes. It's kind of a much darker view than Proverbs, where Proverbs seems like this happy young person, and Ecclesiastes seems like this grumpy old man. But there's also, there's a ton of awesome stuff in Ecclesiastes, not to make fun of grumpy old men because I'm quickly becoming one. But it's just cool to see like the compare and contrast and a lot of the similarities between the two books that are written there. But in transition, I thought it would be good to look at James, because James talks about wisdom. And it talks about two different types of wisdom. We see in James chapter 3, we see worldly wisdom and we see godly wisdom. And I'd like to look a little bit tonight about what the differences between those two types of wisdom are, where they come from, what they entail, what they look like. Can someone start by reading James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18? Chapter 3, verses 13 through 18.
Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior and his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and self-ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly. Comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exit, there is disorder and every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is pure, first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
So here we see James talking about two different types of wisdom. The first one being this idea of worldly wisdom. Did you notice where that comes from? Where does worldly wisdom come from?
Man.
Satan, man. Yeah, it comes from Satan. It comes, literally, quite literally from hell, whatever, like what you want to call that. There it exists and it's prevalent around us today, but it comes from the devil. I think the danger of this is that if we're not careful, we could think that we're being wise, but in reality, that wisdom that we look at as being wise is from hell. What is that motivated by? What is worldly wisdom motivated by? Self-interest, yeah. Selfish ambition. What's best for me? Well, what can I gain from this? So often when we have problems, and think about any relationship that you have, whether it's a friendship, coworker, a marriage, if there's problems in that relationship, and maybe you can think of one right now, what is the root of that problem? Selfish, yeah. And so often, even if the other person is at fault, and they may be 99% at fault, but still there's that focus on what? There's that focus on ourself and our desire. What we want out of that relationship. What we want, and that leads to problems. And if we're honest about this, in some ways, isn't this what we call the American dream? Go out there, promote yourself, go achieve great things, yet the gospel says to do what? Okay, think about it. What else does it say? Jesus says, kind of in two words, Love one another, but about yourself, though. Deny yourself. That's one of the core tenets of the gospel is to deny yourself. And the reason I think Jesus says that is because there's an aspect that in this worldly wisdom that we all have selfish desires and selfish goals and intents. And when I say that, like I somewhat jest about the American dream, and it's not wrong to go out and try to achieve things. But if that's our primary goal in life, then we're missing something. And James is getting out at that because we're told to deny ourselves. I don't know about you, but I have a problem with envy quite often. I get envious and jealous of people that sometimes sit in this room and people that I are friends with and I'm in relationships with. Envy is a problem that I struggle with, and so often do I find myself comparing myself with those around me. And it could be as simple as, like, well, what are they wearing? What are they doing? Where are they going for their vacations? What kind of life are they living? Or something like, am I a better or worse person than them? Do I judge my spiritual life like, well, okay, I'm not great, but I'm definitely better than that person. I'm doing better here, so therefore I'm probably a better Christian. I'm probably a better person because I am better at that than this person. And when you get down to it, that's just self-centered ambition. You can look back in James chapter 2, and it talks a little bit about that with favoritism and to not show favoritism. When you show favoritism to something, especially when James is saying, like, hey, don't show favoritism to the rich, why would someone want to show favoritism to the rich? They'll give you things. It goes back to the same idea. It's selfish ambition. What can I get out of this? It's like that person has something that I want. Therefore, if I'm nice to them, that equals me getting what I want. And if it's someone's poor, they're like, well, that person can't help me out. Therefore, I'm not going to show them any favor or show them any love because of that. The poor person really doesn't have anything to offer me. And this attitude, hence the answers on the screen. What does that selfish ambition lead to? Disorder and every evil practice. So you got this kind of idea, this wisdom that we have, this selfish ambition, this envy, this pride, that leads to disorder and evil. It can be in our homes, in our churches, and in our lives. Fortunately for us, though, James says that there's another way. What's the other way? The wisdom from where? From above. And how do we get this kind of wisdom? What was that again?
Pray about it and ask.
Ask. I heard someone say whisper ask over here too. We ask. It's pretty amazing that there's all this wisdom available from the God who knows everything. And all we have to do is what? Ask. I mean, it doesn't say that you have to do these elaborate set of steps, but you have to ask. Now, there's some seeking and there's some doing involved with that, but you ask and God gives it. There's wisdom that can only be, just like you mentioned, found through prayer, found through talking with God, calling out to Him for wisdom. And you just finished studying Proverbs, where wisdom is mentioned over 100 times. And Proverbs is known as the book of wisdom. Let's turn over there real quick to Proverbs chapter 2. Can someone read Proverbs chapter 2, verses 1 through 6?
My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding. Yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, you seek it like silver and search it as it is for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding.
I think we just like it was mentioned, ask God for this type of wisdom, and He will give it unbegrudgingly and generously. So often when we run into problems, and I'm not talking about like how do I fix my dryer type problems, or what do I need to do to whatever it is, something simple like that. But when we run into real legitimate problems that we're struggling with in our life, where do we turn to for answers? Our friends? The internet? Yeah, I mean, it could be something as simple as like, okay, I'm struggling with this, what do I need to do? And I'm not saying that God isn't in that equation for any of us. He probably is, but is God the first thing that we turn to? Or do we reach out to a family member, a friend, the internet, or all these places that so often will give you advice, but it might be advice that's worldly, where our first reach out, or first phone a friend, or reaching out should be towards God, who says that if we seek Him, He's going to help, and He'll give wisdom. The world, I think, with its resentment and pride, can often give us wisdom that will lead to those disorders that we talked about, or those every kinds of evil. Rather than if we look to God in verse 17, where it says that wisdom from above is pure, it's peace-loving, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without pretense. What I'd like to look at here a little bit, it's interesting as you look through those verses there, that wisdom from God is pure, peace-loving, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, and without pretense. As you look at each one of those words there, does that remind you of anything else in the Bible?
Yeah.
What's that?
Apostle Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit.
Fruit of the Spirit, okay. Definitely fruit of the Spirit there. Anything else? Beatitudes. Yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to go with it. Could also go fruit of the Spirit. But James and Jesus, the Beatitudes and James's letter coincide so nicely next to each other. You can look at passage by passage and see so many similarities to what Jesus is saying to what James is saying. It's almost like James heard it from Jesus or something there. But in James chapter 3, verse 17, it talks about wisdom from heaven is pure. Go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 5 real quick. We're not going to read those verses, but turn over there so you can see them. In Matthew chapter 5, we have the Beatitudes. What would be the Beatitude that coincides with that wisdom from heaven is pure? Pure in heart, yeah, for they will see God, there in verse 8. Wisdom from heaven is peace-loving. Where is that found in the Beatitudes? Peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Wisdom from heaven is gentle. So this one's a little bit, I would say a little bit, not more difficult, but it's a little more interesting. If you look at what gentle means there, it's the humble. It's those that are putting others first and not thinking necessarily about themselves entirely. Wisdom from heaven is compliant. I had to look that word up because I wasn't exactly sure what it meant. No, good thought though. You're close. Poor in spirit. So you're compliant. You're poor in spirit. You realize that there is something that's more important, and the kingdom of heaven is theirs, full of mercy. That's a fairly easy one in verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Wisdom from heaven has good fruits. What's that one? Besides fruit of the Spirit, which would tie nicely into. It's found in verse 6. Yeah, those who hunger and those that thirst for righteousness. Those good fruits can only become by those who hunger for those things. When you hunger for something, what does that mean?
Well, do anything to get it.
Yeah, you really want it. You're going to seek it. And those that hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled, because those are the ones that are seeking God. Remember, we just talked about, like, if you want wisdom, you have to ask for it. You have to seek it. It's not just going to come to you. You have to go out and seek it. Part of that is asking, and there's more that goes along with that too. The picture is that wisdom from above here doesn't result in that evil or that disorder, but instead it's peace and righteousness. And this is what God desires for our relationship with Him and our relationship with each other. Is for us to have the type of wisdom that results in peace and righteousness, rather than that wisdom that's going to result in evil and disorder. Now, this is not peace at the expense of truth, because first of all, if you remember that it's pure, so it's true, and it's not peace at the expense of conviction. We can still be convicted of what we believe, and we can speak the truth from that conviction. But the purity, that truth of God produces what is right and what is good among His people. And only God can give us that. You know, I think that there's a part of that seeking is asking God not only for wisdom, but also the inverse of that, to deliver us from the wisdom of this world. Because it's so easy to get caught up in what the wisdom of this world offers. It's there in our faces constantly. And so I think, yes, it's good to ask God for wisdom because He says to do that. But it's also good to say, God, keep me from the wisdom of this world. Help me see that when something comes up that I may even think is wise, help me to discern between your wisdom and the wisdom that this world is offering. Any other thoughts there? Pat?
This is just a side note. James is thought to be written by Jesus' older brother, or
Half-brother, yeah.
half-brother. And there was a reason that God chose Joseph to be your parents. Isn't this what we teach our children in our homes? Maybe this would help them at home.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's just a side note.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think that's what we want our children to learn and to know is that type of wisdom. Yeah.
I think a lot of God's wisdom comes from the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And in order to gain what you can from the Spirit, what He offers you, what He gives you, you have to be open to it, and you have to allow Him to work in your life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you go through and you do the Beatitudes and you act like Jesus only because the Holy Spirit is working on you.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. Like, the attitudes are not a checklist of things to do.
Right.
It's more of a look at who we become thanks to the Spirit being in us and involved in our lives. Yeah.
Yeah, because without the Spirit, you're not holy.
100%. Yeah. It's interesting that, like, I don't know exactly why they chose a chapter break here in James chapter 3 at the end there, because as you go into chapter 4, and this is probably because it's one letter and they had to put chapter breaks in there somewhere. But I think the thought continues from the end of James chapter 3 as we talk about worldly wisdom and godly wisdom right into chapter 4. Could someone read verses 1 through 3 for us in James chapter 4?
What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures.
Just verse 3. So we have this idea. We saw two pictures of wisdom. We have godly wisdom. We have worldly wisdom. And in a similar way, James gives us two pictures of friendship here. Two ideas of how we have relationships with people. When James brings up these fights and conflicts between the people of God, what is that a result of? What's that? Selfish ambition. It's when we live according to the wisdom of the world. That's the result of any conflict that arises in a relationship, any conflict that arises between the people of God, it's an illustration of what happens when we live according to the wisdom of the world. And this is the result of that disorder and evil that James mentions earlier. James summarizes that in James chapter 4. In verse 4, it says, "You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world is hostility towards God? So whoever wants to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God." There's a choice there that we have to make. We have to choose friendship with one or the other. Jesus said the same thing in Matthew chapter 6, that you can't serve two masters. You have to choose between one or the other. You either can serve God, or some translations say mammon, some say money. The idea there is you can serve God or the world. You have a choice to make there. What does friendship with the world mean? Ideas of the world. I think that's part of it. What does friendship with the world look like? What is that?
It's where you desire to spend time with. That's where you want to be.
Okay. Yeah. It's what we want. There's some desire there. Rick, did you have something?
Oh, yeah, James mentioned it earlier, demonic. I mean, it demon possessed. And there's all kinds of issues that when you're seeking that worldly stuff, man.
Yeah. I like how John puts it in 1 John. It says, don't love the things of the world or things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So it's talking about this love that we have either for God or the world, that choice that James and Jesus talked about, for everything in the world. So here's what friendship of the world looks like. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride in one's possessions. It is not from the Father, but is from the world. If we're honest with ourselves, isn't there something inside of us that desires this earthly thing, these earthly things? In every single one of us, there's a battle raging that we want these things. We have the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and pride in one's possession. If you don't, you're probably lying to yourself. Now, some of us have gotten much better at removing ourselves from those things because I think they've gotten closer to God. But in some way, shape, or form, these things are a desire for us. And Paul talks about, I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I do want to do. It's a struggle. It's not easy all the time. The problem is that when you put people together that have this desire, or have those desires, that lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the desire for possessions, what does that lead to? I think I heard something. I heard a whisper, but maybe not. Destruction, yeah. I mean, ultimately that. It leads to destruction through fights, through conflicts, through coveting, through murder, through wars. It's destruction. I think that's a perfect word to put it. When that battle that's going on with inside of ourselves comes out in the relationship that we have with others, I think about my relationship with Crystal, and I've been married. If you were to ask her, there's always been 100% perfect peace and harmony. We got some laughs there. She would say no. And hopefully I would say that more of those days are yes than no, but we all have worldly passions inside of us. And those desires affect our marriages. They affect our relationship. That friendship or that seeking that wisdom from the world affects us. And it causes problems. It causes destruction. If it's going to affect our relationships on earth, imagine, what does that do to our relationship with God? How does that affect that? It cuts it off, yeah. It separates that. I mean, just like that relationship in your marriage, when you're seeking those sinful desires of the flesh or the desires that you have, it cuts off that relationship. It severs that. Hopefully not permanently, but it's the same way with God. Friendship with the world comes from those sinful desires, and it's motivated by that longing for an earthly pleasure, that earthly things that we seek. And James tells us later that so often when we go to God, what were we doing when we asked God for? What kind of things are we asking for so often? Physical things, stuff. I want more stuff in this world. It's just a reflection of that worldly wisdom that we seek after so often that goes after earthly pleasure. And all throughout this letter, who is James talking to in this letter? Christians. He's talking to Christians, and I think it's the rebuke in chapter 4 is pretty strong. He says, what? You adulterous people. When I pursue the stuff in this world, when I go after things, when I want bigger and better, when that's my focus, what am I? I'm an adulterer. Les.
Well, I like verse 3. It says that when you ask and do not receive, you ask with the wrong motive. Because your motive tends to be worldly pleasures.
Yeah, exactly. It goes back to that selfish desire again, what I want in this.
You know, kind of go on last on that verse 3, ask for wrong motives. The first thing I think about is Solomon. And what he'd asked for with God. I mean, he could have asked for pleasures and riches.
Yeah.
But he asked for wisdom to guide the people. And God gave him everything else beyond that, though.
Yeah, here's a guy who's going to be king, and he's like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't do this. I need help. He realized that, the humility that he had just to ask God. If anything he could have had, it was the wisdom. I think you're exactly right on that, Lance. That's a good call out. I think about adultery, and we think of adultery in physical relationships, and we don't like that word. No one's ever like, you're an adulterer. Oh, great, thanks. Appreciate that. But in the same way, like, are we adulterous with God? And I don't want to cheat on God. But when I pursue the things of this world, that's exactly what I'm doing. That's this picture that James is creating for us, is that we are a bride and we belong to him. We belong to God. And we don't need this world or what it has to offer. James chapter 4 and verse 5 says that, or do you think that is without reason the scripture says, the spirit he made to dwell in us envies intensely. This translation might read differently in yours. There's actually, if you look at this verse, there's different kind of thoughts of what this could mean. I tend to lean towards what I think the New American Standard or the ESV says, that he yearns jealously over the spirit that he has made to dwell within us. In the context of James here, adulterous people who are running around seeking pleasures of the world, God yearns jealously for that spirit that he has placed within us. Like you mentioned earlier, there's this spirit that enables us to be holy and be right, and God yearns for that spirit. And I don't exactly know what that means, but like that, how that plays into our life, because we're a part of that too as well, but it's also the spirit within us. But I think it's the same picture that we see described in the Old Testament with Israel. And it's so easy to point fingers at Israel and say, you guys messed up. You had God there talking to you and fire and smoke, and he was a jealous God there, designed to love his people, and you kind of forsake him. But we have God's Spirit that dwells within us, and so often we're just as bad, if not worse, than the Israelites. Because we do the exact same thing. And God desires the love of his people, and anything that steals that love is going to be met with opposition. It's not going to be like, okay, this is going to be great for you. Mark.
It reminds me of the first sin in the church in Acts 4, when there was this great benevolent need, and Barnabas and many others were selling their things and laying the money at the apostles' feet. And Ananias and Sapphira saw that and saw all the talking up and praising they were getting, and they said, hey, we could use some of that too. So
Yeah.
They brought the money on the pretense. They sold something, brought some of it on the pretense of giving it all.
Look how...
Both to keep some money and have the praise as well.
Yeah, I get the best of them. I get the praise and I get money. I look good and I get what I want out of it. It's that pride, that selfish ambition. It fits, yeah, it's a great example. It fits right into that. This word jealousy, I think that it's important to call out that this is not an insecure jealousy. Sometimes we can be insecure in our jealousy towards others because it's really a problem with us. But God is not insecure. He isn't afraid that we're going to go out into the world and find something better. He's not like, well, I don't want you going out there because I think you're going to find that. You're going to leave me and it's going to be better for you and I'm just going to lose you. God desires us to find that type of joy that can only exist through Him. He wants what's good for us. He wants the best for us. That's where that jealousy comes into play. Crystal?
So I know it says jealousy, but I think of it kind of like God is the Spirit. He's in living in us, so it's like He knows better for us. And like most of you know, I'm a teacher, so it kind of makes me think of like all day I'm with kids and they don't want to do what I want them to do. And I feel like maybe that's kind of how God is. I'm not jealous over their attention, but I'm like, I know better and I know what you need to know. And like, you need to learn this and I'm going to keep trying and I'm going to do all the things I can do. And that's kind of what I feel like the Spirit is like, I want you to go this direction. And we're just like, no, we want to try this. And that's kind of how children are. And
Yeah.
so I think God, He loves us and He wants us to do what's best for what He knows and what we're created for. But we're always distracted.
Yeah. I think that God understands that everything to be found within Him or through when we're in Christ or in God is going to be ultimately more satisfying than anything this world can offer. I mean, the world's got some cool stuff. I like stuff. There's things that I like, but whatever God offers is ultimately going to be way better than anything this world can. Rick, do you have it?
As Crystal was saying that, I was thinking about the children of Israel walking in, being out in the desert. We too sometimes are just like that, just like the kids. No, God, I'm trying to.
Yeah.
And the Spirit is constantly, right, making intercessions for us. He's a knucklehead, guys.
Yeah.
And He always loves us, in spite of our stupidity.
Exactly. And I think that verse 6 goes into that excellently where it talks about, but He gives greater grace.
Yeah.
God continues to give us grace. Because we are, like you just mentioned, Rick, we're like those little children. We're like the Israelites. We do the same things. We reject God, but God continues to give us grace. Not just grace, but it says greater grace. He gives us more and more grace every single day. But I think there's a certain attitude that we have to accept that grace. What is that? Humbleness. Yes, I heard that say there. Because it says that in verse 6 also it says God resists the proud. Not going to give that grace to the proud. But He's going to give that greater grace, the continued grace to the humble. And we see this theme throughout the Bible. This is not just in James. Proverbs, you've looked at this before. He mocks at those who mock, but gives grace to the humble. 1 Peter says the same thing. All of you clothe yourself with humility towards one another, because God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humility is a requirement to receive God's grace. We have to be humble in order to get that. And that's kind of that idea of the godly wisdom, worldly wisdom. Godly wisdom, worldly wisdom says promote yourself. Godly wisdom says humble yourself. That God who created us is jealous for our love. He desires that, kind of like Crystal, I think, had a good example there. Like He wants just like the little children, He wants us to have that relationship with God, with Him. There's this desire for intimacy. And when we humble ourselves before Him, He gives us more and more of that grace. There's this way to live that's not found in worldly wisdom or worldly desires, that fleshly lust and pride, but internal satisfaction that only God can give. And it results in the submission to the authority of God by being humble there. And I think sometimes we read through things in the Word or in the Bible that they're tough, they're hard. And sometimes it can even be discouraging. We're like, man, I am just not able to do this. I'm struggling with this. I can't get past that. This is something that I just can't do, God. But I think that when that happens, it starts with submission. Submitting to His authority and trusting in Him and trusting in His grace to enable you to be able to do that. Because we can't so often, but God can. Because we can't do things so often but ourselves, but as was mentioned, through the Spirit, we can do the things that He has enabled us to do, that He wants us to be doing. And I think James continues on here in verses 7 through 10 that shows us on how we can grow in our intimacy with God. In verse 7, it talks about resisting the devil forcefully. Stop resisting God and start resisting the devil. I think so often we embrace what the world has to offer, what the world can give us. And whatever we are tempted to look at, and maybe it's you struggle with things that are on the internet and pictures or videos, if that's something you struggle with, or if you struggle with saying things and not be able to bridle your tongue, whatever it is, fill in the blank there, resist the devil, and you know what? It says in verse 7 that he will flee from you. That's where it starts. The second, it seems kind of obvious, but it's going closer to God, drawing near to Him. Intimacy with God as you flee the devil. God doesn't say just leave him alone, but He also says, as you flee him, come to me. Purifying your heart, pursuing a life of purity. And in verse 8, it talks about cleansing your hands. There's this idea there that it's almost external where we wash our hands, but it's also cleaning our hearts and our minds. So there's that hearts, purify your hearts, but also cleanse your hands. There's the external and the internal going on there together. Your thoughts, your desires. What is your motivation? Be pure on the inside. Verse 9 talks about treating sin seriously. To realize how damaging the things of this world can be. You know, I think about when was the last time that I was miserable due to sin that I saw. We can see that sometimes in the prophets, where they were openly miserable, where they fasted and wept and tore their clothes. And when have I mourned or wept because of the sin that I saw? You know, do I think that I can be a friend of the world and of God? Because it's not that big of a deal, right? I think James would say otherwise, that we need to treat sin seriously. You know, I think that we wait, Nick, this sounds kind of miserable. This sounds kind of a terrible way to live. Where's the good in that? Why would I want to be miserable, to weep, to mourn? And it concludes in verse 10, when you humble yourself before God. When we mourn and we weep, when we humble ourselves, you know, the good news is we don't have to lift ourselves up, because God's going to do that. God's going to take care of that. When we seek Him and His wisdom, God is going to lift us up, enable us who He created us to be. When we humble ourselves before God, He is going to lift us up. So there's some things there that I think that are, as we desire an intimate relationship with God, we need to resist the devil, to seek God, pursue that life of purity, treat sin seriously, and trust God completely. And when we do that, He's going to give us that grace that He talked about, that greater grace, that continual grace. And then there's one last thing here before we finish. It started back in chapter 3, where it talked about in chapter 3 and verse 2, this idea of two pictures of speech. And we see the idea here of this earthly wisdom or worldly wisdom and godly wisdom continuing. Worldly speech is what? Cruel. It's discouraging. Worldly speech is discouraging. It to slander or defame a fellow Christian or brother or sister, to speak negatively about someone that's not with an intent to build them up. James says that this kills relationships, that this kills marriages, and this kills families. And you know what? This can kill local communities of Christ. Is when we follow our selfish ambition, our selfish desires, and allow worldly wisdom to dictate our tongue and how we speak and how we interact, engage with our tongue with each other. Proverbs chapter 6 goes through some things that God hates. And there seems to be this emphasis on this thing that God really hates at the end there, of one who stirs up strife among brothers. God hates it. I can't even say how strong that hate is. He abhors, if I can't even think of a stronger word, when someone speaks critically about a believer to someone else. When someone creates strife between brothers and sisters, God does not like that. When I tear someone down, God hates that. This is not saying that we don't have tough conversations. Conversations are good, and they're going to be difficult, and they're going to be frustrating, they're going to be hard sometimes, but those are done in love. And that's the difference between worldly ambition and godly ambition. Godly ambition is those conversations happen with love. Worldly ambition says those conversations happen with selfish ambition, with myself, what I want.
It just makes me think that when we're doing these things, when we're stirring up trouble or we're causing strife with another, even any human being on the face of the earth, I think of it in terms of a parent. We're all children of God. And if someone all of a sudden is doing something harmful to your child, that affects your relationship with that person. It is difficult to continue in that relationship as it was prior to the time they started doing whatever it is that's harmful to your child. And when we're doing those things to our fellow man, we're causing harm to God's child. And it's got to change our relationship to him.
Yeah.
There's no way for it not to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as we go through these things, as we think about how we can find wisdom that comes from God or versus worldly wisdom, it's important, it's there, it's present. Worldly wisdom exists, it's not going away. The good news is that godly wisdom is also there. It exists and it's not going away. And God says it can be found pretty easily. And I think the cool thing, one of my favorite aspects of this whole entire passage is verse 6, but he gives greater grace. Without that grace, we don't have anything. Without God's mercy, with God's grace, without Christ, without the cross, we are left adrift. But thankfully, God gives grace, and he gives a grace that continues every single day. So like when you find yourself falling to those desires of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, that kind of passion for stuff, for things, or whatever it may be, realize that it doesn't have to be that way, and God wants you. He wants you back. He wants your attention. He desires you. He desires your love and desires that relationship with you. And it starts with being humble and asking for it. I think that so often when we're asking someone for something, that's humility in itself. When we ask someone for something, we're saying, I can't do this. I need help. And so that's why I think that asking and humility goes so closely together, is when we are seeking God, we're being humble in that seeking in itself. Thank you for your time tonight. I think Ben will be back next week as you guys dive into Ecclesiastes.